Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm back at Books at Lunchtime at Kett's Books, and I'm joined today by Inga Vesper. So, Inga, it's lovely to have you along.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very excited to be here.
Yes, we have been having quite a chat about bookshops and books during lockdown. And one of the books I've read during lockdown, actually, I've left it on my desk, is your book, The Long, Long Afternoon.
Yes.
This is really exciting. I was actually sent a copy of the proof edition. This is the final edition that we have in the shop available for sale, with a biscuit, a burnt biscuit. Did you know about this?
I did. Yes, there was burnt biscuit, and there was a bottle of gin as well, if I'm right, right?
Yeah, well, I don't think that got as far as me.
Oh, okay.
No, just the burnt biscuit was an interesting touch, and
Yes.
the cover of the book is a good clue about what's inside. So I'm just going to try to get that where
Up as well, or find the lighting, get it right.
well. So you can see a very perfect late 1950s kitchen there, full of formica and melamine, and oh, there's a little bit of a glint there. That's a knife.
Yes.
Between the burnt biscuit and the perfect kitchen and the knife, I was immediately drawn in. Would you like to tell us what your book is about?
Yes, so it is about the disappearance of one of those perfect 1950s Californian housewives. She lives in a wonderful house. She's got a loving husband. She's got 2 children. And one day, she just vanishes, and there's a bit of a blood stain in her kitchen, but there's nothing else to give us any clues what might have happened to her. The detective who gets tasked with finding her essentially very quickly just runs into a wall because there's just no evidence. No one's seen anything. No one's heard anything. Everybody speaks very highly of her. The only person who knows a little bit more about what goes on in the family is the black help, and she very quickly turns out to be the one person who had more of an insight into Joyce Haney, the woman who disappeared. But of course, she's not too keen on working with the police because it is the 1950s, and for her, the police are more of a problem than they are ever a solution. And so these 2 characters, Mick the detective and Ruby the help, need to team up to find Joyce and uncover her secret. And I shall say no more.
Well, now, and I'm absolutely not going to spoil any of the twists. But I don't think it's a spoiler to say that, for instance, we've got some really unreliable narration, haven't we?
Yes.
The very first sentence is to the first page. If you get there first, let me know. Yesterday, I kissed my husband for the last time. Of course, he does not know this, not yet. In fact, I have a hard time believing it myself. So that shows intent to do something. She's a woman with a plan, isn't she?
Yes, she is.
What's the blood about? So instantly we're drawn in. I'm really interested in genre with this, and I've made lots of notes and I have several questions, but I'm interested in your perspective. Your agent calls it historical crime. Do you think that's right? Where would you put this?
I think we had to put it somewhere. I'll tell you a story about this book. When I gave this to read to my mum, when I first wrote it, your first reader is always your mum. And she said to me, well, I really liked it, but what is it? Because it doesn't fit in anywhere. And I was extremely disheartened because I thought, oh my God, I've written a book that shouldn't exist because it touches on so many things. But actually, I think that was an advantage because I think my agent quite liked it because it is a bit of a mixed bag of many genres. So I do think historical fiction is correct because it is set in the 50s. It's a crime novel. But there is a lot more going on because I love to read crime, but I like crime books that tell me more about a time period or a problem than just the actual incident. And so I think there is a lot of, there are feminist themes, there are themes of sort of social justice. And I think there's also sometimes the book is I hope it is quite humorous, and so I do think there are various genres that it would probably fit into. I think historical crime is fine, but you could equally put it on a sort of a woman's shelf or a general historical fiction shelf.
Definitely not humor, though. No, there are
No, it's
humorous
not.
moments.
No, it's too serious to be funny. But
Yeah, although there are moments of lightness. That, I mean, it covers so much ground. It's absolutely a murder mystery because there's a very clear whodunit and where has Joyce gone and whose blood is it, etc. Um, it is historical because it's set in the 1950s. Just, we've talked a lot on Books at Lunchtime about how setting kind of determines everything else. So if you are in, is it Sunny Lakes in California in 1959, and you have a black, they would have had black help in the house. So right there, you've got your setting, and so your racism is going to come out of it. The misogyny is going to come out of it. The mental health issues are going to come out of it. Years of child abuse and the effects are going to come out of it. So it's really packed full of issues.
it is, and I hope it's still a light read. I don't want to sort of scare people off by thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be assaulted with every single social problem. It is. I do think it's quite. I wanted to write something that is a real joy to read, but I did find it really important to depict the time of the late 50s as truly as I could, because I think it's a time period that we feel very nostalgic about. And there's a lot of people sort of thinking back, oh, this is when, it was a simpler time. The gender roles were clear. We didn't have these big discussions. We didn't have to worry about, I don't know, being woke or whatever. But actually, it was a very, very bad time for many, many people. And I didn't want to shy away from that. I felt like if I want to write a book that is set in the 50s and kind of deconstruct this myth of the perfect housewife a little bit, there were all of these other things that were going on in the background that were just about to burst through the surface. The civil rights movement, feminism, the 1960s counterculture was just around the corner. And it was really interesting for me to look at these tensions that were already there if you were looking for them, but just not quite ready to come out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They were all there, but I was really interested in, because if you call it historical fiction, we've tried to define that ourselves recently. We kind of said it's fiction that you don't have a grasp on personally because you haven't been there. Now, you have never been a Black woman in 1950s
Yes.
California, unless there's something I don't know.
No.
And neither have I been a Black woman in 1950s California. How did you actually try to get into that character to make it authentic? Because some people living amongst us
Yes.
now were.
Absolutely, yes. And it was a very, very difficult decision for me to make. And actually, I didn't make it for a long time. I had many, many sleepless nights wondering whether I would actually be able to write this book. And in the end, I thought, okay, this is my first book. So I wrote it long before I had any dreams of publication. So I thought I can just write it, see how I feel about it. If it doesn't work, I don't ever even have to show it to anyone. I can just delete it and it's fine. I ultimately decided, I mean, what would the answer be? To make her white? I could have made her some waitress, called Sally. And I kind of felt like that's not the answer either to that problem. So I thought what I have to do really is to educate myself as well as I possibly could about what the lives of the African American community at the time was like. And I did as much as I could. And I spent a lot of time online in author forums, and especially in American critique forums. And I posted my stuff and said, can any African American authors among you please tell me whether you think like I can pull this off? And I got a lot of extremely helpful critique. But generally, the response was positive. I've not yet had anyone tell me that, you shouldn't have done this. And so that is very positive for me. I'm still, I have to say, I'm still, 80% of me is sure that it's certain that I've pulled it off. And 20% of me is still questioning that decision. And maybe actually as a white person and a white author, that it's not a bad place to be, where you keep questioning your motives a little bit and, really continue to be concerned about whether you did her justice.
I always find that people who seem to have the best grasp on a situation are the ones who keep questioning it. So, I mean, I'm really interested as well in your research around the medication, because I had never really known that. The Guardian put it really well in a couple of phrases. The book takes us into Stepford Wives territory, California's suburb of Sunny Lakes in 1959, where housewives have to be tranquilized up to the eyeballs in order to bear the smallness and isolation imposed by the American dream.
Yes. So I didn't set out with the intention of making this a big part in the book, but then as I researched the 50s, it became clearer and clearer to me how prevalent this was. And I saw one study that found that at some point, like throughout the late 50s, 50% of American women were on some kind of tranquilizer. 50 every second one. And I thought, this is incredible. They're supposed to have this perfect life, and they're all on drugs. And then if you look at the marketing for these drugs, there's an advert in the book for a drug called Milltown, which is a real advert. I didn't make that up. It's literally a picture of this perfect woman doing the dishes, and the husband comes in and gives her a peck on the cheek and says, "Since I take Milltown, our fights have turned to kisses." And it's just it perfectly encapsulates why these women were taking drugs, because they were so unhappy, but the men did not want to know about this. The men wanted them to function. So all you had to do was function. And what made you so sad just didn't matter. Nobody really cared. As long as you kept doing the dishes and smiled, you were fine. And so you had to take these drugs to kind of keep you in this sort of level where you could just barely function, but at least it did function. So obviously no problem, nothing to see here. Let's move on.
That's incredible. It just makes me think about people that we know of, and historical figures and writers and so on, that they were in that context. It's astonishing.
And it makes you think, well, I'm not surprised that these women struggled so hard to fight back, because they were constantly sedated, So why do we have so few kind of, let's say, big writers from the 50s and big artists, like female artists? Of course there were some, but most of the women were just on drugs. They were just sort of getting through the day. It's terrible.
Absolutely. I really appreciated, I've looked for her name and I can't find it because I've read this several weeks ago. Mick Blake's wife, the detective's wife. I thought that she was so well balanced, and she wasn't in a lot, but she kind of was normal, healthy woman, a bit grumpy, a bit difficult to get along with, probably not medicated. I really liked her.
Fran, yes, she's one of those characters who just kind of popped out. I think I did no planning for her whatsoever. I just wrote, mixed married. That's all I did. And she became, she is not in the book a lot, but I think she is really important, because I did want to show, because I didn't want to write a depressing book, and I did want to show that things can work differently between men and women, and they can work well between men and women. And it was really important to me that Mick, as the sort of the man in the book, has a happy marriage to a woman who is, her own woman, and he is richer for this, and their relationship is richer for this, because I did feel it with, men have a very important role to play in tackling sexism and issues around, the patriarchy and so on. But I did really want them to be fine, to demonstrate that. And also, I'm a little bit tired of the sort of detective trope where, the detective is always like a really horrible person with an alcohol problem and 3 divorces and some sort of massive childhood trauma. And I thought, why not write a detective who's basically like, he's doing okay. So the problem is not about him. The problem is the society that he is dealing with. That's what I found, really important. Didn't want him to distract from the overall story. So yeah, he's by and large happily married to Frank.
And he's a father of daughters.
Yes. That is also actually, again, something that I didn't think about at all during the writing, but then later turned out to be quite important.
And the more I sort of look at the list of characters, so I didn't forget anybody's names that I've scribbled down, there are an awful lot of women in this book, and men. I mean, Joseph and Ruby have a mostly healthy relationship as well. And I wouldn't say that it's a book about women's issues as much. There's an awful lot more going on than that, but it is absolutely there, isn't it? And I suppose because of the treatment of women, the rest of the book fell out of that.
Yes.
And even into 20 years before the book even starts. I really liked Dina as well. She's another minor character, but as someone who's different to the rest of the cast.
Yes. I did feel that the issue of class, I mean, I think in America it's not so much, a thing that is talked about the way it is talked about in the UK. But, the fact that poverty, so Dina is a sort of a working class woman who also attends this committee of women who meet every week to kind of talk about household stuff. But she's really I would say, looked at with quite a lot of disdain by the others because she has to work. And this idea that work gives you liberty, I think that it's very important, but it's also a bit dangerous because, a lot of feminism at the time was about, oh, if we went out to work and had our own money, things would be better and we wouldn't be in this situation. But Dina works, but she works in, low paid kind of dead end jobs that are available to her. And I think she's equally trapped as these, pretty little housewives because she's, she still has to do whatever her boss says, and she doesn't have the liberty or the brain space to kind of think amazing thoughts. And I felt it was quite important to bring in that aspect of the 50s as well, these sort of, terrible working conditions and, very few rates. Still, I think, is a massive problem in America today and to some extent here. Yeah.
No, I'm really, really glad you did include Dina. I think she added an awful lot to it. So you said about trope for the police officer, and there is a lot that one could imagine becoming a series of crime novels, but this doesn't feel to me like one that is going to become the Ruby detective series, the Ruby and Mick.
I don't think so. So personally, I do not read a lot of series. I get tired of characters very quickly. And I think that these characters in the book, they're very much of a certain time. I think Ruby in the 60s would also be extremely interesting, but not as interesting a detective as she is in 1959. And equally for Mick, I think Mick goes through a very, very interesting character journey and transformation, but then that story is kind of finished at the end of the book, and I don't know what other journey I could send him on. So I don't. A lot of people have asked me this, and they said, "Oh, we want to meet these characters again. Will you write a second book for them?" And I'm a little bit like, I don't think so. I think they stand very much in their own story, and you can make up your own stories. You make up how their lives continue.
It would be fascinating to put them in the present, though.
Yes,
all these years later.
It would be very, very, because there's a lot of, I think Mick even says that at some, there's so much going on between them that cannot be said out loud. And now a lot of these things can be spoken out loud. And I think they would have very, very fascinating conversations, these two, if we could have them around a coffee table today. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, it would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
There are so many things I cannot ask you about because I don't want to spoil things. I will just say that I was reading it quite happily, and then something does happen about halfway, 2/3 of the way through the book that I was not expecting, and my little jaw dropped. So it is a page turner, and it's just a really good read. So thank you very much. So when someone has finished reading this book, and I've heard seen a lot of people online saying they read it in one sitting. I certainly read most of it in one sitting. What would you recommend they read after they've enjoyed the long, long afternoon?
So I read a book recently, I think it's been out for a while, but it's still quite new, called Little Fires Everywhere by Celest, I think. And there is that Little Fires Everywhere. It is absolutely fantastic. It covers a lot of similar themes than my book. It's also set in a very suburban environment, but it's set in the 90s, I think, right? And that is such an interesting comparison. So it's almost like if you wanted, it's not quite, but if you wanted, a second The Long, Long Afternoon or a continuation, that book is something like it, because
interesting.
yeah, I think it really picks up on a lot of the same themes, and a lot of the stories of women and of suburban neighborhoods and families and family dynamics, and how dark things can get between people who are very, very close to each other and love each other very, very much. I think those are very common. Those are themes that these two have in common. And then I also just read a book called The Deaths by Mark Lawson, which is set in the UK. And again, this is a theme for me, but it's about a murder, or a series of deaths in a community of very sort of newly wealthy family who lives in beautiful sort of Oxfordshire village, and everything is it's quite posh and quite sort of wine and cheese and all of that, and everyone's doing extremely well in London, and and then suddenly someone dies, and it turns out again that a lot of this, I won't spoil anything, but this sort of wealth doesn't necessarily make you happy, nor does it solve all of your problems. And then the third book I want to recommend is a book called Random Family by Adrian Nicole LeBlanc, who is an American author and journalist. She's a non-fiction writer, and she spent 15 years following or befriending the wives or girlfriends of drug dealers in the Bronx, starting in the 80s and taking us through all the way to the 2000s. And she's written an absolutely incredible book, basically told from that perspective, but she takes herself completely out of the story. So it's such a riveting read because it's told directly from the voices of these women. And I think that is what makes it so amazing, because you feel like you don't need a translator to understand their lives. And it's very much about being extremely rich and then extremely poor and going to prison and having children and being abandoned by men and domestic violence, but also just being in the situation and making a life there and, being proactive about it. Because I think we look a lot at kind of, what we'd say are marginalized communities or whatever, and we see them as victims, and they're not, they're women with fully developed, rich lives. And I think that comes out really well in this book.
Excellent. I'll have to look that one up. We also have a bit of a shared admiration for someone who's very local-ish to us, W.G. Sebald was in Norwich for a long while. Which of his did you recommend?
I recommend all of them, but I do recommend The Rings of Saturn, which is, how do you describe a W.G. Sebald book? It's basically about a walk he took along the Norfolk coast. I think to Lowestoft. Yeah. And but basically he writes books which are very sort of melancholic, and he goes on to these amazing, it follows a train of thought, and so you basically get an overview of the entire history of the 20th century and the British Empire and the Chinese silk trade in a book about a walk, through Norfolk. And it's an absolute tour de force. And these books are very undescribable. You just have to read them. You'd never think that a book like that can be written, but it can, and it's very, very good.
Yeah. And it's one that we keep, but when I went to screw around the shelves, I just gave up, because where are you even going to put it? In it's not astronomy, even though it's called Rings of Saturn, someone might put it there. And it opens, from what I remember, it opens with him in a hospital bed in the old Norwich Hospital, which is on our Norwich Road, Newmarket Road, and looking out the window at the sky over Norwich. So it does very much have a very, very local feel. Actually, shame you missed it. 2 years ago, there was a full gallery dedicated to his works in that book in particular.
I think there was a film that came out as well, right? With was that a bit older? Yeah, I think I did hear about it, but I didn't get to see it. I mean, he's very dear to my heart as well, because he is a German-born author who lived most of his life in the UK, so we have a lot in common. I think he was also down to get the Nobel Prize of Literature, which we do not have in common. So we can hope.
Give yourself time. You've only just written this a few weeks ago. Give it a month.
Maybe, roundabout.
Yeah, well, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you. I really, really enjoyed hearing you tell us more about the book, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much. Yes, I am working on edits to the second one, and it's very, very hard to follow up the long afternoon. So watch this space.
I'm sure you will do it absolutely admirably, and we can't wait to see it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again,
Okay,
Inga.
thanks. Bye.